Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Martin Rauchbauer. I'm the director here at Deutsches Haus at NYU, and I would like to welcome you not only to Deutsches Haus, but to our mini NYU festival, which is part of the Penn Festival. We are all very excited to have here with us three literary giants who came here, and I would like to describe, before I introduce them each individually, I was thinking of what they have in common. Barbara Frischmuth to my left from Austria, Norman Manea from Romania, and Claudio Magris from Italy, and I would say they all share this belonging to an imaginary space, which we call in German Mitteleuropa or Central Europe. And if I look and describe, for example, Norman Manea and the region he comes from, at the beginning of the 20th century, it was called the Bukovina. And if you look at the many ethnicities that used to live there and to some extent live there, Bukovina was the place of Czernowitz and of Suceava, which is your birth city. In the north were the Ruthenians, or what is now called the Ukrainians. In the south were the Romanians, but there were also Polish people living there, Germans, people who spoke Yiddish, so a patchwork of different languages, and that describes a little bit a situation that was common throughout Central and Eastern Europe at the beginning of the 20th century. If you look at Claudio Magris, who comes from Trieste, the old seaport of the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy, also a place that until today is a place of where many ethnic minorities come from. The city itself, of course, they speak Italian there, Slovenian, Croatian, and German. But again, if you look at the history of the 20th century and the tragedies and the horrors of this history in both of these regions, this ethnic pattern changed, destroyed, many people suffered, many people were murdered. And if I look at Barbara Frischmuth, she comes from Austria, from Altaussee, which also has a literary history. But then you move to Graz, which became a center of the literary avant-garde in Austria, and you joined the Forum Stadtpark. You also then later moved to Vienna, where you lived for many, many years. And you joined the Wiener Gruppe there, and you also had your literary debut at the famous Gruppe 47, which was, of course, the leading literary group of the post-war German-speaking world. You wrote many, many novels, theater plays, radio plays, also children literature. You translated from English, but also from Hungarian. You studied Turkish and Hungarian, and those two languages are very important for your literary work as well. And you won numerous prizes for your work, and you have a connection with the United States as you spent some months as a writer in residence in Oberlin College in Ohio some time ago. Claudio Magris, he was born in Italy, and he has published numerous essays and critical studies on writers such as Wilhelm Heinze, E.T.A. Hoffmann, and Joseph Roth. You became very instantly famous with a collection of essays about the Habsburg myth in Austrian. It's a book on the Habsburg myth in Austrian literature, and got worldwide acclaim on your book, The Danube, which was a literary travel along the river from the west to the east, which was published in the United States to great acclaim in 1989. You received the important Italian prize, the Premio Strega, in 1997 for Microcosmi, which microcosms in English, and in 2004 the Prince of Asturias prize. Your most recent work in English is also the reason why you're here in the United States, to promote your book Blindly. I think in Italian it's Alla Cieca, and which is also available for sale. You live in Trieste, and apparently if you want to meet Claudio Magris in Trieste, you have to go to the Café San Marco, an old literary cafe, and maybe you have luck and you can meet him sometime there.
Only for a few days still, because there is a danger that this cafe is going to disappear.
Oh dear, that's very bad news. Coffee houses maybe another thing that that unites these three writers. Claudio Magris asked me yesterday when we met in what language we were going to hold this event. We could easily have this event in German, all three of you speak it, but we decided we would do it in English. Norman Manea, to my right, he left the Romanian dictatorship. I already mentioned he was born in Suceava. You left the Romanian dictatorship of Ceausescu in 1986 with a scholarship of the German Academic Exchange Service, which brought you to West Berlin. And then a few years later, you arrived in the United States in the spring of 1988. Your biography, and you wrote about it in your memoir, The Hooligan's Return, was marked by the Holocaust, and Romania was an ally of Nazi Germany. Your family was deported and deported to Transnistria, and only some members of your family survived and returned to Romania after the war, and you grew up in Suceava and then managed to leave the country in 1986. You are teaching you're a professor at Bard College, where you teach European culture, and your work has been translated into more than 20 different languages. You have won very important American and European literary prizes, among them the MacArthur Grant, the Prix Medici, Nonino International Prize and the Nelly Sachs Prize, and you're also a member of the Berlin Academy of Art and the British Royal Society of Literature, and you were highly decorated by the French government. You live here with your wife Cella in New York. I would like to start this question that we've posed at the beginning of this panel. Is there a literature of multilinguality that we've kind of, this was an idea by Barbara, that you tell us a little bit about what you mean with literature of multilinguality. The dictionary defines multilingualism as the capacity to speak many languages. You speak several languages, not only German and English, but also Hungarian and Turkish. What does literature of multilinguality mean for you?
Well, when I heard the first time about this topic, well, I have to say something at the beginning. I never was a member of the Viennese group, but I was befriended with the ones like H.C. Artmann, Gerhard Rühm, and so on. But I never was a member of the Viennese group. Well, when I first met with this topic, I tried to find out if there is a literature that really contains a few languages and melted it to one. And I came to the language of the Osmanic Empire. And there was a big literature produced by people living in this empire. And the language, the official language of the Osmanic Empire, Osmanish, was...
the Ottoman Empire.
I beg your pardon?
I think it's the Ottoman Empire.
Ottoman Empire, well, okay. The Ottoman Empire, the language they wrote and spoke was a mixture of 1/3 of Arabic, 1/3 of Farsi, I mean what the Iranians speak, and only one weak third it was Turkish. This was a case like, the Emperor Karl V, who said German was at his time only spoken to the horses. And that's what Turks say too, that Turkish was at that time only talked to horses. And this language was very, very multi-layered, you had to be very educated to write in this language. And this increased, and so when Atatürk came, one of the first things was to demolish this language, to leave the Arabic writing and to try to turn Turkish intellectuals to a newly invented Turkish that was only bound to the Turkish grammar, and the Turkish grammar had the possibility to take in many, many words. But the trouble was, after many years of being absolutely separated from the literary tradition. This new Turkish didn't mean the same as the old one, and because many of the newly created words didn't have the same broad meaning. So in the 80s, writers even like Orhan Pamuk or others of his age turned a little bit backwards again and started to use the old expressions again. So I think there really are languages in this world that consist of a few languages. And of course, this is a product of history. But I don't want now to teach anybody Turkology. It just was very curious for me. And the other, shall I go on or shall, no.
But may I interject here and ask you, would you then define Turkish literature, which you know very well, contemporary Turkish literature or historically from the Ottoman times over, would you say this is a literature, an example of a literature of multilinguality, therefore?
You mean the language of the Ottoman Empire?
So you would only say about the Ottoman Empire?
You know, it started to consist of more and more illusions. So, as I said, you had to be very, very educated to read in this language, especially to read poetry. So it was clear somehow that it had to decline. But then, when the New Age began after Turk and all these writers born afterwards the Arabic language had been cut out of everything, they had to deal with a big loss, a loss of tradition. You know, they were just, and it lasted a few years until literature could take that. I mean, the literature written after, in the first years after this clash, you know, it sounded a little bit funny because everybody tried to invent new words. And for translating, that's why I never really translated from Turkish because it was too difficult. I had to use 4 different dictionaries to translate the new poem because everybody invented his own, and most of these newly invented words were just not in the dictionary. So you had to ask the writers themselves what they meant.
Claudio Magris, you are an Italian writer, you write in Italian, but you're also a professor since many, many years for German literature at the University of Trieste, of Torino and of Trieste. So you have dealt with the German language very much. How much does this knowledge of foreign, this familiarity with foreign literatures, with foreign languages, how much did it influence and impact your own literary work?
Yes, first of all, I would like to say that it is also funny that we are 3 writers who don't write in English. We are speaking in English about multilingual literature, and English, as you say, a language whose dominion in all over the world, it's not the opposite, but anyway, it's very interesting. And another thing, when you spoke about Middle Europe, it's like a chewing gum that you say can mean one thing and the opposite. For example, could be the metaphor for German nationalistic program like Naumann, even a Nazi program, Zurich, but Middle Europe was an idea against every fascist and Nazi totalitarianism, and later against the Soviet totalitarianism. It was the idea of a multilingual and multicultural dimension. A writer I have admired, he was also my friend, Johannes Urgidi, the author of the Prague Triptychon, said, ich bin Hinternational. It is a joke with the word hinter, which means behind. I am behind the national, behind the nationalities. And another thing, concerning myself, I think there is a great, I hope, stimulating contrast between my culture, which is certainly more a German culture. I know the German literature because I was teaching it better than the Italian literature, probably. Especially the category, the cultural categories of philosophy are category belonging to the German culture. My language is absolutely Italian. I have written in German, I have written articles, essays, but I couldn't absolutely write a tale, something fiction, not fiction, fiction or sensual imagination, literature in German. Not because of lack of knowledge, it's not that the problem, but because my way of perceiving the word, of putting the word in order, of feeling the word, is absolutely not to distinguish from the Italian language. But another thing is, what is Italian language or Romanian language or German language? So I think a certain dimension, multilingual dimension, exists also inside of language. For example, when one of the greatest writer of the world literature of the past century, Svevo, wrote his novels, his Italian was considered, until Joyce and Valéry Larbaud and Montale discovered his enormous greatness, a bad Italian. That is to say, what was it was something like something pre-lingual element, something hidden deep in the depths, which gave to his absolutely normal Italian another dimension, a wonderful dimension, a great dimension. From the poetical point of view, it's unbelievable great language.
Did it have anything to do with the fact that Italo Svevo was from Trieste?
Certainly, in this case, certainly, because we have, every of us has in some more, some less. There are writers who has grown up in speaking different languages, other inside of only of one language. But everybody has different layers, levels, also in the language, influenced also unconsciously. And that is very, I think it's very important, this dimension. Concerning myself, for example, the only experiment I made from a literary point of view of multilingual literature is a play, the exposition, with a mixture of Italian, classical, old Greek verse, Triestine dialect, especially vulgar and come si dice basso, low dialect as expression of the grisère of life, and so very difficult to translate. And Hanno Helbling, a great translator who translated also Montale, had marvelous translated into German.
For which audience did you write that?
For the theater.
And people understood it?
The problem understood. Yes, sometimes literature is not necessary to understand literally everything. When we are reading also Russian novels in Italian translation, not always do we understand every nuance, but we understand like the music. It is another meaning, another sense which is communicated. It's not like a communication concerning the organization of everyday life. And for example, when I think of Norman, he's Romanian. And I don't mean which one of the four recognized Romanian languages. One is also the language of a small minority of the Chichi in Istria. 822 people, I have shaken the hands to everyone as if I had shaken the hands to 300 million of Americans. But in which language? The language of the child which coincided more or less with the discovery of the unbelievable cruelty of the word in Transnistria and in the childhood the language of the other exile, and the same language concerning grammar, syntax, and so on, but it's another language. I think we must distinguish between the multilingual in a spatial sense, like this very, very interesting what she said about. We had also to distinguish that from the conflict inside writers who are living in another country, like in your case, for example, writers who either write in a language which is different from the language they use 5 minutes later speaking with neighbor and so on, or who are writing in a language they have learned, Nabokov, and which became not only a wonderful language, but also their own. Even inside the same language, for Paul Celan it was a great a problem to write in his mother language, which was the language of the murder of his mother. And a wonderful, a very interesting example of this is the literature and not literature in the world of the Caribbean. For example, a wonderful writer, Glissant, who had discovered this identification with the other and the role between the French, which is his language, he's a classical French writer, and the Creole, which is for him not the colored, picturesque language, nor the, which is disprezzato, despite, despite it.
Held in contempt, disparaged.
Language of the former slaves and so on. But another dimension of reality. And this Creole exists inside of his French. And we had to distinguish, it is very, very interesting because this problem is not only the problem of like the great example, the Turkish literature and so on, but it's, I think, the problem of every writer. When in a writer we don't feel this complex ambiguity, even in a writer who is writing only in his own mother language, that means something not necessarily good for his creative vital writing. And another thing in the end, also a language has to do also with the pre-lingual element. When in your novel the character discovers or believes to have been come una fata,
a fairy.
A fairy. That means that the language has to do, especially the artistic, poetic language, with the other mythic pre-lingual element, which is the basis, the body, the flesh of literature and of writing literature.
You mentioned also Norman's language, the peculiarity of your language, and I was very struck yesterday. The two of you had an event at the Public Theatre, and you were saying at one point that when you came here to the United States, you felt that you were brutally cut off of your language, of Romanian, and that made you, at the beginning, prefer to write essays rather than fiction, because you had the feeling that it was easier to translate, and you had the feeling you could make yourself more easily understood. What is this peculiarity of a person in exile, that he's cut off, as you said, brutally, of one's own language, and then to write in a different foreign environment?
Yeah, I came here without English, as you can even hear now. My today Gypsy English is not the very best, but I hope you can understand me. I came here without any English, and I would have preferred to stay in Europe, where in Germany or in France would have been much easier for me. So I had to start from nothing. I was deaf and mute, and it was a big trauma for everybody, I think, especially for a writer, who suddenly, in the moment when he has a lot to say, because he comes from a society which was a closed society, and where the censor was the biggest force, the biggest linguistical controller of the country, has to say a lot. Exactly in that moment, he doesn't have the means. Exile is, generally speaking, a very deep trauma. For a writer, it's even more than that. It can be the end of his creativity. But exile is a human experience which is very old, starting from the Bible and the Greek mythology. So it's nothing so new. What is new is that the effect of the exile is very well spread today in a globalized society, and where people move a lot from one place to another for different reasons. So it's a global society, and it is a multilingual society, of course. Even here, if you go on the street, this is a country of exiles. You will hear many languages, and you will have practically the entire planet in front of you. Facing a new culture and a new language, especially at an age where when the changes are more difficult than in your youth, is great, a great and extreme experience, but it's also, in my opinion, an extraordinary pedagogical experience. You have suddenly to face the unknown outside you, around you, and inside yourself. And you have to watch all your changes daily sometime, even in your psychology, even in your way of seeing the world. Because another culture doesn't mean only a linguistical difference. It means usually a difference in thinking, a difference in expressing, and in a different way of writing. And I faced this here also very much. But as I said, it's not so new, and today it's almost banal. This doesn't make this difficulty less complicated, less heavy, less overwhelming, but it makes it more general and more common in our epoch, let's say so. Unfortunately, speaking about this very hospitable new world, which is our great pragmatic America, we should say that despite the fact that it is a country probably with the greatest diversity in the world, exactly because it is a country of exiles and everybody came from a certain place, from a certain culture. The amount of translations here is ridiculously small. The last studies at the UNESCO showed that the amount of translations in America is the same as in Greece. This Greece, which is always in crisis, as we know, but has a way of life which is very pleasant. So what to say? It's a pity, I would say. And this self-sufficiency, which is due partially also to the English language, because in the moment you know English, you have the feeling, and it's not only a feeling, that you are in the world, wherever you will be, you can manage with this language. It's not the same with my great Romanian, as you may imagine. So I can go on. It's a very, very multi-layered topic. But what I would say, because we spoke about translations, that the place where we feel and we find the greatest multilinguality is the library. In any library, in any big library of the world, we have books in all the languages, not necessarily only written by writers in that language, but also translated from one language to the other. This communication became, in our modern crazy time, with another speed. It's everywhere, it's instantaneous. We have these little devices which contact us with any place and any person at any moment. So it took another dimension today, this problem of multilinguality and of translations. You cannot start, in my opinion, a war, speaking about war, because we are in culture, we forget the great disasters. We cannot start a war in Iraq or in Afghanistan and win the place only from a military point of view. It will never happen, or if it happens, it will not last. You have to have people who know the language, who know the culture, who know the psychology, and know the people. If you are a great empire, as America is, you have to take care of all these aspects if you want still to remain this great power and not to give up to the Chinese.
So you're telling Americans that if they want to conquer the world, they need to better learn foreign languages?
I would say they should linguistically be more prepared. And I don't mean, as I said, only Romanian. Of course, Romanian too.
One more question to you. Claudio Magris said that although he writes occasionally in German essays, it would never occur to him to write in any other language than Italian when it comes to fiction, to literature. How about yourself? You're now here in the United States. You write beautiful novels in Romanian. Do you ever think about writing fiction in English?
It's not about thinking, it's about doing it, if you can. As I said, I came without English. And it's not, in order to write fiction and to write literature, you have to have English as the inner language. Of course, now I learned enough to go to buy a bread and even some pair of shoes, but it's not the same thing. And I read a lot of books in English because I teach also. So I face students who know certainly English probably better than me, but I still am able to correct them. To write fiction, to write an essay, and to write even, let's say, with great risk, a love letter to your lover, I don't think the best thing is to write love letters using the dictionary. But if you are forced into this, you do it because love is more important than language, we know this. But to write fiction is another story. It has to come from your inner language. And the difference, the contrast, and even the contradiction between your inner language, which is a language which grew in you and with you, in your country and in your linguistical environment, to your readings, to your writings, the contrast between this inner language and the exterior language, the language of the environment, remains important and enhances the tension and the intensity of your linguistical life, if we can say so. I am, as you know, and as you see, very young, so I still have some hope to be able to write at some point not only fiction in English, but love letters too.
There are, of course, famous examples of writers who did write in languages that were not their native tongue. Joseph Conrad is one of them, Nabokov. How did this study of foreign languages influence you? Did it ever, I have to ask you as well, ever occur to you to write, for example, fiction in Turkish or in Hungarian or in any other language? And if not, did this study of these languages and their peculiar structure, because they differ a lot from German and from other European languages, the grammar, the structure, the poetry of those languages, did they influence in some way your own literary work?
Yes, in some way it did, because I learned to look at the blind spots of our language. If you study a language that has another character, like Turkish, Hungarian, they have a very different grammar from the Indo-European grammars. They differ in the respect that they express their grammatic relationships by fixing a little syllabus on the end of the word. So, and they have quite another way of expressing with their verbs. They have verbs that have into it if an action is done slowly or often or I don't know what. That means these actions are much closer to the speaker than they might be in German. And of course, if you try to translate from these languages, you find out that there are some things in German you never address. Of course, you can translate it in transcribing it and doing things like this. But there always remains something you didn't get. And that's very interesting for a writer, to find out about your language, that it's not the almighty one, and you have to help your language, I mean, to express things by, putting another sentence to it. But I am still intrigued very much about languages that take into them other languages. And it always has been a project from avant-garde to try it out. I mean, I remember in Wiener Gruppe or Ernst Jandl, they did poems in different languages and tried to merge them. But the greatest writer, I don't want to compare him to Italo Svevo, but for me, the greatest writer was James Joyce. And he, in his Finnegan's Wake, did really something very outstanding, and he mixed the languages. I had the honor at the beginning of the 70s, when Wolfgang Hildesheimer, a German writer, was doing the Anna Livia chapter for Surkamp in Frankfurt, and I had the honor to find out the traces of Hungarian, of Turkish, and of Persian in the text, and I really found them. And some people ask me why I think Joyce did that, and where he got it from, and I think the answer is rather banal, because he was, liked to drink alcohol, and he did it in the evenings in the little small wine houses near the harbor in Trieste, and all the people from the ships came there and were drinking too, and he had an open ear for all these things. So it always fascinated, but there's another thing very fascinating, that all our languages consist of other languages too. All the European languages have Latin in their back and on their ground, and that makes it much easier for us to learn a European language than, let's say, Turkish or Hungarian. Even Hungarian had Latin as its official language until the 18th century. Then it had German as the official language, and only in the 19th century they got to Hungarian. I mean, and if you take a close look at German, and I think in English it won't be very different, you find so many Arabic words in our language you would never think of. I mean, it starts with alcohol and ends with sugar. And in between, I mean, I could read a few to you just to give you an example. It's from amalgam, alchemy, algebra, alcohol, alkali, alkovum, almanach, amulet, aniline, and so on, benzene, I mean fuel, and sugar, and well, you have so many words taken over from Arabic, and you never think about it. So languages have a secret mixture, a secret life in which they mix together things that were important at some time.
I want to ask now a question to all three of you, and you again mentioned it in your opening statement that it's ironic that all four of us, I have to say, are not English native speakers, and yet we speak English to each other. So there, of course, that's one of the reasons is that we're here in New York. But also, it might happen in other places in the world, in Europe, that writers, when they meet, they speak English with each other. What does this dominance of English do to literature? Is it a new lingua franca, and is it a good thing because it enhances communication, or do you think it is also problematic?
I don't think that I can really answer this question. It's from the literary point of view, it's not a lingua franca. It's of course a great literary language and a lingua franca for communication and so on. I don't think that it is, generally speaking, certainly for some people living in countries in which English is not a language learned because one is English or American, neither learned to travel and so on, but living together with other languages, like in a lot of countries of the world. In this case, perhaps also English can be a lingua franca, like Venetian language or dialect in the Mediterranean, Adriatic. And another thing I want to say is also we could perhaps distinguish between spoken language and written language for a writer. There is an anecdote concerning Svevo and Joyce, my father, who spoke English much better than his degenerate son, was taught for many years by Stanislaus Joyce, who lived there. He is also buried there. Joyce was with Svevo in an inn. That is, I thought of this episode, and Svevo, the bottle of wine fell and was broken. And Svevo said an obscene exclamation. And Joyce, horrified, said to him, "Such words one can write but not say." And here we have two dimensions: the one who had never written but told, and so. And from this point of view, and this mixture of languages, the best definition of Ulysses is given, in my opinion, by Joyce himself in a letter to Svevo, in which he writes, it's very difficult to translate this joke. Today I have worked on my novel, Ulysses, ovvero in Triestine dialect, tu mare grega, literally speaking, your Greek mother. We have in Trieste a very important Greek colony. A Greek mother had not a very elegant expression for the virtue, and it meant in this dialect like son of a beach. But mother is also the sea, and this allusion also to the sexual relationship with the mother is also this regressus in uterum of Ulysses in the Mediterranean old, come si dice grembo? Come si dice? Il grembo, the womb, the womb of civilization. And to finish, to come very briefly back to the multilingual inside of the same person. There are some very interesting examples. For example, Ursula Hirschman, the sister of the Hirschman, the famous professor of economy and so on, I have known her very well, and she has lived all her life, practically very young in Italy, have always spoken Italian and also written something in Italian, spoken Italian with their children and so on. In the last year of her life, she spoke suddenly only Yiddish. And she couldn't really communicate with her children because the children couldn't always understand what she said. Certainly, this hidden language, which was not dead because it emerged, Ursula Hirschman is not a writer, but certainly the same problem. How is acting, working in silence, a hidden, forgotten language? How can a forgotten language be important for a writer without his knowledge of that? This is also a multilingual dimension.
Would you like to address this question of whether English has this potential as a literary lingua franca?
I think the fact that English is very spread today everywhere is a positive fact because it helps people to understand each other. From a literary point of view, it's very different because it's a difference between information and literature. Literature is not information. Literature is creativity, and this is not based on the elementary English which is necessary to communicate between people from Europe, Asia, Africa, and so on. This is a direct language for dialogue, for understanding, let's say a pragmatic type of goal, but the inner soul of the language is reserved for people who write literature in English. They can be from everywhere, especially from the countries where English is the main language, but not only from there. But it's a very different aspect between the importance for communication and connection and the literary power, the literary energy of a dominating English. I have to go back to Chinese, to my old Chinese. We can imagine that in the moment then China will become really the dominant power. It's a country with a huge population, with many provinces. It will be a different story. In every language, it's also an evolution when we speak about multilingual. For instance, I will speak about two languages. Romanian, for instance. Romanian is a Latin language. And for an Italian, it's possible to understand something in Romanian. For a Romanian, it's easier to understand an Italian. Because the Italian, after a while, is lost. Romanian is a combination with Old Latin and a lot of addition which came from Slavic, from Turkish and Greek language. So at a certain point, you are lost. Another example is the language of exiles. For instance, because you mentioned Yiddish. Yiddish is a kind of, we can say, medieval German dialect, yet because it's a language of diaspora and of exile, the language migrated with the people from one place to another and took in a lot of linguistical contributions, Russian, Polish, and so on, Romanian too. And you have this very special situation of people who are exiled. The Spanish Jews, which were forced to leave Spain in the 15th century, took their language with them. This is called Ladino, the Old Spanish. Any doctorate in linguistics which want to write a thesis about the Old Spanish is looking for these old Jews who still spoke in their houses wherever they lived, in Russia, in Portugal, in Greece. They spoke their old Spanish, not changed for centuries. You don't find it more in Spain, because in Spain, the language evolved normally with the history of the country. So we can continue, but you should make a sign when you are bored.
Norman, the best example for the difference between information and creativity is the Jewish saying, I think from Talmud, the Lord has said one word, I have heard two.
You don't have to be bored if you raise your hand. You can also raise your hand if you want to ask a question. But before I open up, I would like to bring one more example of multilinguality to the table, and that is literature of immigration, particularly in the United States, but also in Europe. In recent years, writers with an immigrant background have created a literature where they use a lot of their own language and mix it with the language of their new country. In Germany, there is Emine Sevgi Özdamar, who and many others too, and there's Dimitri Dinev and many who use a very peculiar language where they mix and create a kind of new language. And here in the United States, Juno Diaz and many others. If do you think that is going to become prevalent, literature of immigration, thinking of migration patterns in recent years?
Well, as far as I am informed, only Sevgi Emine Özdamar creates a new German. The others write in German. And of course they write of their background, and they brought a lot with them. And I think in future time, teaching history in Germany or in Austria would mean to teach Turkish history too, because, or Greek history or so on. So I think it's like a kind of an injection of a very lively injection to the German language, and the German language can need it, because I think that purists always ask for the wrong things. I mean, to stay with the German that has incorporated so many other languages, and they think it's still pure German. So I think purity doesn't exist as far as language is concerned. And you said about the Jewish, I mean, in Turkey there is a whole community, the Spaniards, as they call themselves, and there is a very good outlet. No, I just forgot the name. We are very young, so it happens sometimes. It's Levi, yeah. And he writes about Istanbul, and this Istanbul is quite a different Istanbul than that of Orhan Pamuk, let's say, or my Istanbul, because I have Istanbul in many of my novels. So, well, I think language does do something to us and to everybody.
Yeah, I would want to add something. Something rather anecdotal, which I think still shows a lot about this new wave of immigration, migration, whatever you call it, exile, which is everywhere. Some 10 years ago, I was at a conference in San Francisco of Jewish writers, and it was a huge Israeli delegation with writers of very different origins, from Iraq, from Germany, from the Czech Republic, from France, which settled in Israel. And at a certain point, somebody put this problem. What will happen if the greatest poet in Hebrew language of the next century will be a young man whose mother is a Filipino woman who married a Romanian worker? Both of them settled in Israel. Israel took in some people from Vietnam, from other countries. And the answer was, and this was at least partially a surprise, it came from the Israeli delegation, wonderful. So it's a bit of a contradiction and a paradox, because these people settled there to reconstruct a mythological dream, let's say, mentioned in the Bible and mentioned all the time in all the prayers next year in Jerusalem, which meant a certain coherence. What happens if the greatest Jewish poet is not a Jew? Nothing bad happens. What should happen? If he has talent and the poetry is good, that's it.
You said that many new words were formed at the time of Ataturk. They cleaned the language of Arabic and Persian roots. And you said some people like Orhan Pamuk were going back on that. And my question is, when a language is written in 3 different scripts, like Turkish, it's written in Cyrillic in former Soviet republics like Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and written in Roman characters now in Turkey, and Arabic characters in Azerbaijan, in Iranian Azerbaijan. You know. What will happen? They will become, some of them have tried to adopt Roman as writing, but some haven't. Like in Xinjiang also, they still write in Arabic characters. You look at Chinese currency note, they also write, that's the Uyghur language in Arabic characters. What will happen to this language? One language written in 3 scripts, like in India and Pakistan. Hindi and Urdu are basically the same language, but they are written in 2 different scripts. One in Hindi is different, Urdu is different, but basically the same language. Will they develop as different languages, or
well,
what will happen?
I just don't know, but I think that, I don't know, I couldn't say it, but I think it was for the Turkish language better to write in Roman characters, because the Arabic writer did not really reflect all the vowels, all the ös, üs, and so on. So it was always difficult, even if the Turks themselves, to read Turkish in the Arabic letters, because they had to know the word before they could read it. So I think in this case it was better for the development to write in Roman capitals in the our writing. Yeah, let's say.
There emerges a Trieste that was multilingual, perhaps as no other city in Europe. And I just wonder, what is the influence on literature? Now, of course, we know Svevo and we know Joyce, etc. But what is the outcome of this multilingualism? Did it have any effect on the literature in Trieste, or is this all gone?
Thank you. I think I don't think that we can speak of a real multilingual reality in Trieste. Not even in the past. Trieste was not like Fiume, Rijeka, in which really the contacts between Italians, Hungarians, Croatian existed. So Trieste, the situation was different. There was, first of all, the Italians didn't speak Slovenian, this language of the Slovenian minority, also because of social reasons, because in Trieste, it was a difference with Gorizia. The Slovenian had not bourgeoisie, and we had this phenomenon of the minority, which also, until a certain time, became Italian. On the other hand, a great distance. The relationships between Italians and Slovenian have been very, very hard, very bad. Already before fascism, Italy was not the best government for the Slovenian minority. Later, Slovenian or Slav nationalism was also bad, like every nationalism. And I don't think it is a little mythical. The German, for example, German was much more known than Slovenian in the Austrian time, but unfortunately not so well known as it should be. For example, in my family, my mother had spoken German, but not as really as a quotidian language in her life. And now there is this tendency to an ideal vision of Trieste. I like Trieste, but it must be recognized that the national tension were very, 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 very hard. Trieste have had the only one extermination lager in all Italy. In the it's small, but anyway. Concerning literature, we have this phenomenon, the typical phenomenon of Trieste. The most passionate Italian patriots of Trieste, who died also in the First World War for the Italian of Trieste, had Slovenian names, that is origin German, of course, Jewish name, Armenian, and so on. The typical example is Scipios Lataper, who is not the greatest author, but the writer who invented the literary landscape of Trieste. And Lataper is very typical. In his book, Mio Carso, which created the literary landscape, the first three sentences begin, I would like to say to you. He would like to say he was born in Croatia. It's not true. He was born in the Carso, the rocky Slovenian territory surrounding Trieste. It was not true. In Moravia, it's not true. To speak to the others, these others are the Italian. But he too is an Italian. He will die for the Italianity. But to his wife, he writes, you know, I am Slav, German, and Italian. Italy is in the third place. But to express this difference of being Italian but not identical to the average Italians, but different, the only possibility is the old strategy of all poets, that is to say, to lie. Poietai, polla, pseudontai, said the Greek. The poets are great liars. That is to say, but sometimes certain lies, better, certain metaphors are the only possibility to express something which is not possible to express directly. From this point of view, the literature in Trieste was born from this not, come ci risolta, not overcome contradictions.
If there are no more questions, I would like to say that Deutsches Haus is very honored and proud that we had this discussion about multilinguality here. We are not a place of multilinguality ourselves. We don't have a great library, but we do teach one language, German, here. So if any of you are interested, we have certainly information about it. I want to thank Claudio Magris, Norman Manea, and Barbara Frischmuth for this wonderful afternoon. I'd like to thank you. I would also like to thank the wonderful Pen Festival, World Voices, the organizers of not only this event, but and the literary Mews outside. But the entire festival has been wonderful and is ongoing. Thank you very much for coming. I hope you will enjoy many more events like this. Thank you.